Okay, so good morning. Today's daf is daf Mem Hey in Masechet Menachot. We are at the Mishnah near the bottom of Mem Daled and Mebet. Mishnah presents a good place to just get started, so we'll dive right in. This Mishnah is going to continue the list of offerings that are not essential to one another. There are various situations where if you don't do X, well, then you can't do Y. Here are situations where even though you don't do X, you can do Y. So let's take a look. Haparim, the ha'elim, the hakivasim. When it comes to the bulls, the rams, and the lambs, einan ma'akvin ze'etzeh. They are not essential to one another. Now, can be understood in two different ways. One could understand this as just meaning that if you don't bring bulls, you can still bring rams. And if you don't bring rams, you can still bring lambs. And if you don't bring lambs, you can still bring, bulls and rams. And maybe I should have said both of them. If you don't bring bulls, you can still bring rams and lambs. So in any event, that's the way the Gemara. That's one way that the Gemara could understand it. But it seems like the Gemara is actually understanding it as if you don't bring all of the bulls, then you don't have to. You can still. It's still worth bringing some of the bulls, and if you don't bring all of the rams, it's still worth bringing some of the rams. And of course, the same thing is true for the lambs as well. What korbanot are we talking about? Meaning, this is not intended to be for every korban. There are certain korbanot that we do say that they're ma'akvinis one another. And so we will, that's the first topic that the Gemara will discuss. That's the Gemara is going to clarify what this is referring to. So continuing on, Rabbi Shimon Omer, Rabbi Shimon says, Im hayu lahem parim merubim, when you have a bunch of bulls, so v'lo hayu lahem nesachim, and you don't have enough of the libations to go along with them. Yavi par echad unesachim. You should bring one with the nesachim, meaning that if you have a requirement to bring 7 bulls or whatever, so then or 2 bulls, and you only have money for one nisachim, the Beis Hamikdash doesn't have enough money for the nisachim for both, then you should bring 1 bull with its nisachim. V'lo yakrivu kulam below nesachim, and it's better to do that than to bring all of them or any of them without their nesachim. That's the implication. It's not necessarily clear, and it doesn't have to be that the Tanna Kama disagrees with Rabbi Shimon, but many commentators say that they do argue. So the Tanna Kama would say, no, don't focus on whether or not you bring the Nesachim with the animal. After all, we've seen that you can bring the Nesachim even 10 days later, so you don't have to bring it at the same time. And so as a result, that's fine. Don't bring the bulls that you're required to bring now, and you'll deal with the Nesachim later. But that, again, that's not what Rabbi Shimon's perspective is. Rabbi Shimon says best to do the whole thing all at once, even though you can do the Nesachim later. Okay, so now the Gemara begins by trying to identify the offerings referenced in the Mishnah. So, Hani Parim Ukvasim Tehecha, which bulls and lambs does this refer to? So, if you want to tell me that it's referring to the bulls and lambs on the holiday of Sukkot, well, kamishbatam ksibahu. That can't be, because it says in accordance with the law or in accordance with their law that and as Rashi tells us, take a look, kamishbatam, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 lines up in the from the bottom of Rashi. Mashma ikuva. The fact that you have to bring them with according to their law implies that it's a requirement that you have to bring it. And if you'll ask me, well, 1 second, what about the first day of Sukkot? There it doesn't say Kimishbatam. Well, that's what Tosos addresses. Kimishbatam, Ubiyom Rishon. And the first day of Sukkot, Delo Ksiv Kimishbat, Ksiv Be Yehiyu. We are going to see very shortly that the being verb, and we've seen this over the course of our learning of Zvachim and Menachos together, that the being verb also can constitute an indication of something being required. So there's the being verb, and so as a result, it also is required. Ela de Rosh Chodesh. So the Atzeres, the Chumash Hapakudim. So it maybe is referring to Rosh Chodesh and Shavuos in connection with what is in the book of Numbers, namely Bamidbar. Right? Pekudim is another name for Bamidbar, Sefer Bamidbar. So that is the answer, and the point is that in both of those places there are multiple bulls and lambs that are offered. I think it's 2 bulls and 7 lambs. They are also offered with 1 ram, but we aren't asking about rams at the moment. We're about to ask about rams as we turn to Mem Hey Amud Aleph. But the bottom line is that in each of those cases there are multiple bulls, multiple lambs, and so as a result you can offer one and you don't have to offer all if you don't have it. So Elim da Hecha. So now we go and ask about the rams. Which rams are you talking about? Idahanu, if you say it's one of these, namely the Rosh Chodesh and Shvuas Korbanot in Parshas Pinchas in Sefer Dvarim, so Da'ayilhu, well then it's a single ram and not multiple rams. So as a result, that cannot be what we're talking about. And because our Mishnah said rams plural, ayalim. So ida atzeres the Torah's kohanim. And if you want to tell me it's about the holiday of Shavuos, that's the korbanot that are mentioned with respect to Shavuos in Vayikra, in Parshas Emor, havaya ksiv bahu. There it specifically says a being verb, as Rashi says, second line down in Rashi on Mem Hey Amud Aleph, Havaya Ksiv Behu, Yehu Olah. The pasuk says that they will be an Olah. V'kol Havaya Ikuva. And every being verb is an indication of it being essential. So, La'olam Da'atzeres the Torah's Kohanim. Really, it is referring to the Sefer Vayikra, the Ayalim there. V'haki Kamar. And here's what it's saying. Lo elim de Torah's kohanim ma'akvile la'ayil de chumash hapekudim. The bottom line is that there are 2 sets of rams that you need to bring. One set of rams, which are a korban olah, that are brought essentially for the holiday and are referenced in Vayikra. And then there's one ram that is brought as a musaf offering, also as an ola. Below ayal dechumash hapakudim ma'akev lehu le'elim deTorah's kohanim. That when it comes to the 2 different sets, that's what are not ma'akev. So the rams. So if you bring only 1 ram for the korbanot that are in Sefer Vayikra, you will not have fulfilled the obligation because there's a reference to 2 rams. And if you once you bring those 2 rams, you don't need to also have the ram that's referenced in Bamidbar. And if you offer the ram that's referenced in Bamidbar, you don't need to also have the rams that are referenced in Vayikra to fulfill the obligation of the ram that is mentioned in Bamidbar. So you can fulfill Bamidbar's obligation separately from Vayikra's obligation, even though you might think, well, we'll just add it all together. There are 3 rams that you're supposed to be bringing. If you don't bring all of them, then you're going to have a problem. And the answer is no. If you bring the 2 that are supposed to be from Vayikra, you're fine. And if you bring the 1 that's supposed to be from Bamidbar, you're fine. The situation where you're not fine is if you bring only the one of the 2 that's supposed to be from Vayikra. So Ela Parim, Da'afilu ahadadi lo ma'akvi. But the Gemara then says, but that's a different definition of what we mean by ma'akev from what we're talking about with respect to the bulls. Because the bulls where we're talking about, it's even within a sefer, within a sefer. So here in Sefer Bamidbar, there's a requirement for two bulls, and if you offer one, that's sufficient. But ve'elim dahacha udahacha udulo makvi. It's only across the svarim that you say that they're not ma'akev. Inhu ma'akve, but within Sefer Vayikra they are ma'akev. And so as a result, when our Mishnah said haparim v'ha'elim v'ha'kvasim einan ma'akvin zed zed, that the bulls are not ma'akev each other, the elim are not ma'akev each other, and the kvasim are not ma'akev each other. It has different meanings. For the parim and the kvasim, it's even within a sefer they're not ma'akev. Whereas for the ayelim, it's not. It's not true. It's only across the svarim. So tani mili mili katani. So each word is taught, on its own, and so as a result, you're absolutely right. The meaning of the word rams in this context is a little different from the meaning of the bulls and the lambs. Okay, so now we cite a quote, a brisa that provides the scriptural basis for the lack of essentiality of the Rosh Chodesh sacrifices. And we do it by quoting a pasuk from Yechezkel. And this pasuk seems wrong because the pasuk seems to suggest that the korban for Rosh Chodesh is different from what it says in the Torah. And we're going to, in the end, see a series of three more situations of the psukim being seemingly inconsistent with the Sefer Torah. So, case number one. Uva Yom HaChodesh, so on the day of the Chodesh, meaning on Rosh Chodesh, Par Ben Bakar, you have one bull, Tamim, V'sheshes Kivasim, and 6 lambs, V'ayil, and 1 ram, Tamimim Yayu, it should all be unblemished. Now the problem is that we're supposed to be 2 bulls and 7 lambs. The 1 ram is correct, but you're supposed to have a different number of bulls and a different number of lambs from what it says here. So par matamolomer, what is it teaching us from the fact that it said par when in fact it's supposed to be parim, namely 2 par? So lefi shenemar b'Torah parim, because after all, since in the Torah it says parim, u'minayin she'im lo matzah shnayim mevi echad. How do I know that if you don't find 2, you should at least bring 1? Talmud lomar par. So what the pasuk in Yechezkel is teaching us is that even if you can't do both bulls, you should still do 1 bull. What about sheshes kvasim? What does that come to teach us? And here the pasuk, it actually says sheshes, and so the Masoras Hashas corrects this to get the language right. Matal Melomer, what is that coming to teach us? Because Lafisha Kasa B'Torah Shiva, after all, in the Torah it says 7. So the answer is Uminayin She'im Lo Matzah Shiva Yavi Shisha. How do I know that if you can't find 7, you should bring 6? Talmud Lomar Sheishes. So that's why it says 6. So now I have another question. She'im lo matzah shisha yavi chamisha, chamisha yavi arba, arba yavi shlosha, shlosha yavi shnayim, ba'afilu echad. How do I know that if you can't find 5, 4, 6, 5, 4, 3, or even 2, you should bring whatever you can, even if it's just 1? So Talmud Lomar, that's what the end of the pasuk says. This part wasn't quoted before. Vilakvasim, that when it comes to the lambs, kasher tasig yado, whatever you can afford. So you might have thought that meant that you should do more if you can. No, it's just saying that if you can't do the full 7 that it says in the Torah, you do whatever you can. But 1 second, once you tell me that we say v'lakvasim kasher tasig yado means you do what you can, and if you can only do 3, you do 3. If you can only do 6, you could do 6. But if you can only do 1, you do 1. Well, then ma'akar d'ksiv hachi sheishes kvasim lamali. Why does it need to mention any number of lambs? So dekama de'efsher lahadure mahadrinan. Now the point is that I might have thought that, look, I can just afford this because I want to save for something else. No, It's whatever you can afford. Whatever you can do, whatever you can find, that's what you should do. You do the best that you possibly can. So uminayan shema akvin zedzeh. All right, so we'll go back to that in just a moment. So the point is that when we say that you can do it according to your means, it literally means whatever you can afford, that's the amount that you do. And of course, we're talking about it on a community basis. So it's the community being able to afford them. Uminayan shema akvin zedzeh. And now, how do I know that all of these bulls, that both bulls and these seven lambs are essential to one another? Talmud Lomar, Yehu. It says Yehu. And so, uh, um, and so but this is a little bit odd because we just said a moment ago that that it isn't actually obligated. And so Tosos here helps us out. Perish kisheyesh lahem kol hatzorech. Meaning, when you have everything that's necessary, that's the situation where you're not going to, where they're now going to be essential. Rashi puts it similarly. If you already have two bulls, or seven lambs, then you can't go and say, oh, I'm just going to bring some of them. I'm not going to bring all of them. So that's why it says Yehiyu. So the point is that in the pasuk, and this Yehiyu, it's important to note, is not in the one second, this pasuk, the Yehiyu that we're referring to is in the pasuk in Yechezkel. And so as a result, that's the situation that when you can do it and you choose not to, that's where it's now going to be essential. But so as a result, if you choose to bring fewer, then that's going to be a problem. Okay. So now that we've referenced that situation, that now we're going to say that now we're going to, once we referenced a pasuk in Yechezkel that has a problem that we've now explained, we're now going to quote three more psukim from Yechezkel that are apparently inconsistent with the Torah. So, Ko Amar Hashem Elokim. Here's what Hashem says. This pasuk is Yechezkel Perek Mem Hey pasuk Yurchet. This is what Hashem said. Barishon, in the first month, Be'echad lachodesh, on the first day, so that's Rosh Chodesh Nisan, Tikach par ben bakar tamim. You should take an unblemished bull, v'chitesa es hamigdash, and you should cleanse the temple. And chitesa, of course, sounds like chatas. Chitesa, but why are you using the term chitesa? The Gemara asks after quoting the pasuk. Olahi. It is a korban olah. There is a chatas that is offered on Rosh Chodesh, but it's not a bull, it's a goat. And so as a result, this sacrifice that is done on Rosh Chodesh is is supposed to be an olah. So this bull. And so how can you tell me why is it using a language of chitesa? So Rabbi Yochanan, and Rabbi Yochanan was in an earlier generation of the Amoraim, and he says, Parasha zu Eliyahu atid l'dorsha. Eliyahu is going to be the one to tell us what it's meaning. Rav Ashi Amar, Rav Ashi is one of the latest generations of the Gemara. He says, no, I can tell you what it means. Miluim hikrivu bimei Ezra. That when Ezra came back, there were inaugural offerings in those days. Kedero shekrivu bimei Moshe, just as they brought in the days of Moshe. And Rashi explains us what he's saying. So take a look, Rav Ashi Amar. It's probably 5, 10, 15, about 20 something lines down in the narrow lines of Rashi. Rav Ashi Amar, Aniya Farshanam, I'm going to explain it. Miluim hikrivu, the miluim that they brought, what that's referring to. V'hach nevuah Yechezkel al bayasheni. Yechezkel was prophesizing about the second temple. Nisnav'ah. That's what he was prophesizing about. Shekrivu miluim, that they would bring the inaugural sacrifices. V'chihechi dehikrivu miluim de Moshe bishmini, just as they brought those sacrifices on the eighth day of the establishment of the Mishkan. Didu Dahabi Rosh Chodesh, and that day itself was Rosh Chodesh Nisan. Amrina b'Masechah Shabbos, as we say in Masechah Shabbos. Berishon be'echad lachodesh, right, in the first month, in the first day of the month. So Vitana Oto Hayom, that same day, Natal Eser Atarot. So there were 10 different crowns. Ve'kriv Egel ben Bakar lechatas. And they brought a bull that was as a sin offering. The Hachanami Hikri Par Berosh Chodesh. So too, this bull that it's referring to is intended to be a chatas. It's not the chatas that is brought every Rosh Chodesh Nisan, but on the Rosh Chodesh Nisan, when you dedicate the second Beis Hamikdash, and may we also have the opportunity to dedicate the third Beis Hamikdash, that's when you bring this chatas offering. Okay, so, and when you know how we know this, Tanya Nami Hachi, we actually have a baraisa along this line. Rabbi Yehuda Omer Parasha Zo Eliyahu Asid La Darsha. Rabbi Yehuda says that this parsha Eliyahu is going to darshan it. Amarel Lo Rabbi Yossi. Rabbi Yossi says no. Miluim Ikrivu B'mei Ezra. It's telling us that they brought inaugural offerings in the times of Ezra. Kederach Shekrivu B'mei Moshe, just as Moshe, they did it in the times of Moshe. Amar Lo, and Rabbi Yehuda said to him, Tanuach datcha sheinachta daiti. Your mind should be at ease because you put my mind at ease. Here we have a pasuk that seems to be inconsistent with the Torah, and that's not a good thing. And so I felt nervous about the fact that we weren't going to know what it meant until the days of Ezra. And so as a result, but now until the days of Mashiach, until Eliyahu comes and teaches us, and now I feel good that I know what it is. Next situation, question number 2. A kol nevela utrefa mina ofu mina behima lo yochlu kohanim. So now we're the pasuk says, and this is a pasuk in Yechezkel Parak Mem Dalid pasuk Lamed Aleph, where it says that when you have a nevela or a trefa, whether it is a bird or a larger animal, the kohanim are not allowed to eat it. So the Gemara asks, Kohanim de lo yochlu. Is it only the Kohanim that can't eat it? Ha Yisrael achle, but the Jewish people can eat it? That doesn't make any sense. We know that all Jews are prohibited to eat nevela and treifa. So Rabbi Yochanan parasha zo Eliyahu asid l'darsha. Rabbi Yochanan says here that Eliyahu again is going to have to explain it to us. And Ravina, who lived around the same time as Rav Ashi, so he also, though, gives an explanation and lived much later than Rabbi Yochanan. Kohanim itzrichle. Actually, it does need to tell us about the Kohanim, because Salkatay Tekamina, I might have thought, Ho of Ishtri Malika Ligabayu, since when it comes to Malika, remember that Malika involves the slaughter of a bird essentially from the back of its neck with the thumbnail of the Kohen. And that is not a kosher method of slaughter when you're not dealing with a sacrifice. And yet, it is kosher when you do it with a sacrifice, and that Kohanim are allowed to eat that animal. They eat the meat of that bird. So I might have thought that because if you use Malika outside the Beis Hamikdash, that would constitute a nevela, and yet, and so nobody's allowed to eat it, and yet inside the Beis Hamikdash, what would otherwise be a nevela is now kosher. Maybe Kohanim are just generally allowed to eat a nevela and a treifa. So Tishrei Nami nevela treifa. Maybe they should be able to eat a nevela and treifa for Kohanim. So Kamash Malan. That's why the pasuk in Yechezkel needs to tell us that, you know what, they cannot. They're not allowed to. That brings us to the third pasuk from Yechezkel that's problematic. And this pasuk is Yechezkel Perek Memhei pasuk Kaf. And it says, Um, V'chein taseh b'shiva b'chodesh. So you should do on the seventh day of the month. Me'ish shogeh, when there is a person who is unwitting, meaning he's shogeg, umi pesi, or he's ignorant, he doesn't know. V'chipartam es habayis, and you should purify the house. Now there is no special korban on the seventh day of the month of Nisan. And so, what is this referring to? So Shiva. So what is that referring to? Rabbi Yochanan, who again was the person who said we had to wait for Eliyahu for the other two. Here he says, you know what? I can tell you the answer for this one. Elu Shiva Shvatim Shechatu. This is when you have seven tribes that sin. Remember when we were learning back in Horios, we learned about the special korban that that is brought if the community sins as a result of a mistaken teaching by the Sanhedrin. And the situation where they have to bring this korban is when a majority of the community sins. So what is the definition of the majority? Is it only when you have most of the Jews living in all of Israel? Or do we say that even if seven of the tribes were to sin, that would be sufficient, even if they don't constitute a majority? So Rabbi Yochanan is saying that the seven here, because seven is a majority of 12, and there are 12 tribes, it's telling us that if the seven of the tribes sin, so then you're going to be obligated. And even though you don't necessarily have, when you count the number of people, it could be significantly less than the majority. Indeed, if one thinks about it, when we say that seven tribes sin, it means the majority of seven tribes sin. So if you have 51% of seven different tribes, and then you have 100% of the other five tribes not sinning, it could be a very small minority that have sinned, and yet what this pasuk is telling us is that even so, that's when you're going to still have to offer it. Now, what does the term chodesh mean? Meaning, why is it required to say chodesh? There's nothing to do with any month that's associated with that. The point is im chidshu v'amru chelev mutter. The situation where you're obligated for a mistaken ruling is when they teach something new, like teaching that chelev is kosher. That's not true, and it's not correct, and it would be a very innovative and new teaching. So that's what that teaches. It can't be something that, the bottom line is it can't be something that's essentially already exists as a rule. It has to be an incorrect rule. Me'ish shogeh umipesi. And then we say that it's got to be unwitting or an ignorant person. What is that teaching us? Milamed she'ein chayavin ella al ha'elam davar. That you need two aspects. You need the Sanhedrin not to have realized their mistake, that they were oversought. There was an oversight in their ruling. And you need that the people themselves did not realize that it was a mistake. Now, if you were to tell me that chalev is kosher, I would know that that's a mistake. So it has to be a rule that the people don't realize is a mistake, and only then is the community subject to a par halam davar. And so that is the third and final of the additional situations from Sefer Yechezkel. So having resolved a series of inconsistencies between Yechezkel and the Torah, the Gemara notes that Yechezkel was almost hidden, meaning it almost didn't become part of the accepted Tanakh. Amar Yehuda Amar Rav Zachor also Ha'ish L'Tov, that this person should be remembered favorably, and that's V'Chanina ben Chizkiah Shemo, and his name is Chanina ben Chizkiah. She'il Malehu, without him, Nigna Sefer Yechezkel would have been put aside. Shahayu Dvarav Sosrim Divrei Torah, because its words contradicted the words of Torah. Ma'asa, what did he do? Hela Shalosh meos garve shemen. He took 300 barrels of oil. V'yashav ba'aliyah udrasho. He decided he was going to sit down and figure them all out, and that's exactly what he did. And so as a result, because of those drashot, we were able to maintain Sefer Yecheskel. Rabbi Shimon. So now we quote back to our Mishnah, which said that according to Rabbi Shimon, im hayu lahem parim merubin, if there are multiple bulls, well then you want to make sure that you have nesachim for them. Tana Rabbanan. We have a brisa that's going to explain the perspectives of both Rabbi Shimon and the Tanakama. The Efa lapar, the Efa la'ayil yaseh mincha, that you should make an Efa for the bull and an Efa for the ram as a mincha. Uva kvasim kasher tasig yado, and for the kvasim you should do whatever you can afford. V'shemen hin le'efa, and a hin of oil for every ephah. But that, of course, is not consistent with what the Torah says. The Torah says that there are a different number of ephahs for a bull and for a ram. And so as a result, how are you understanding this? And again, this is also from Yechezkel, so it's consistent with the situations that we were talking about previously. And so, Rabbi Shimon, midas parim be'elim achasi, are they one measure in the Torah? They're not. A bull is supposed to have 3 isaron, and a ram is supposed to have 2 isaron. Why is it talking about an ephah? Ela she'im hayu lahem parim merubim v'lo hayu lahem nisachim yaviu par echad unesachav. No, the point is that you should bring the right amount, and that if you don't have more than you don't have sufficient, so then you should not bring more rams than you have nesachim for. The al yikru kulan below nesachim. Don't bring all of them without nesachim. V'imhayu lahem, and if you had the ability to have enough, so then elim merubin v'lo hayu lahen efasan yaviu ayel echad the efaso below yikru kulan below efod. Again, don't bring partial. Bring what you can. And so that explains why Rabbi Shimon says what he says. And again, presumably the Tanakama would disagree and say, no, you focus on the number of bulls, worry about the nesachim later, because the nesachim don't have to be brought on the same day. Okay. Our next Mishnah, so that brings us to the next Mishnah. The next Mishnah continues our listing of sacrificial items that are not essential to one another. And as a reminder, the 2 loaves brought on Shavuot are accompanied by 2 shulamim lambs. And we saw previously in one of the Mishnayos in a previous parak that the 2 loaves are essential to one another and the 2 lambs are essential to one another. Now, we did not address yet, and then we're going to have it in this Mishnah right now, whether those lambs and loaves are essential to each other, meaning, do you need the lambs for the loaves or the loaves for the lambs? That's what this Mishnah is going to address. And we're going to also address the other sacrifices on Shavuot. And those sacrifices are in general not going to be essential to one another. And so we're going to start with that because that's the general topic of our perek, of things that are not essential to one another. So v'hapar, v'ha'elim, v'ha'kvasim, v'ha'sa'ir, when it comes to the bull, the rams, the lambs, and the goat, ein ma'akvin es halechem, they are not essential to the bread. V'lo halechem ma'akvin, and the bread is not essential to them. Now, when we're talking about these different sacrifices, it's important to note that the bull, the rams, and the lambs, that's referring to the olot sacrifices. And the sa'ir is referring to the chata sacrifice. The shlomim sacrifice we are not discussing at the moment. So, halechem ma'akiv es hakvasim. But now we're going to switch to the topic. In fact, let's take a look at Rashi, top Rashi on the Mishnah, last of the wide lines on Memhe Amud Bet. Hapar ha'ilim v'akvasim diksivi b'haikra, that are written in that pasuk, v'hikravtem al halechem shivas kvasim tamimim b'nei shana upar ben bakar v'gomer. This pasuk that is in Vayikra Perek Kaf Gimel pasuk Yudchet. when it says that, that's the animals that we're talking about, and those are all the olot. So that's the situation. So those olot and the chatas of the goat, those are the ones that are not essential to the bread, and the bread is not essential to them. But halechem ma'akeves hakvasim, but the bread is essential to the lambs, and now we're referring to the kvasim of the shlamim, the shlamim lambs that are brought on Shavuot. Ve'ena kvasim ma'akven es halechem, but the lambs are not essential to the bread, meaning that if you don't have the lambs, you can still bring the bread. Divrei Rabbi Akiva. So again, Rabbi Akiva says you need lambs in order to bring bread, but you don't need bread in order to. You need lambs. You need bread in order to bring lambs, but you don't need lambs in order to bring bread. Okay? You need bread to bring lambs. You don't need lambs to bring bread. Amar Rabbi Shimon. Rabbi Shimon says the exact opposite. Rabbi Shimon ben Nanas says the exact opposite. Lo, that's not true. Ki ella lo ki ella hakvasim ma'akvin es halechem v'halechem eno ma'akev es hakvasim. The lambs prevent the bread, meaning the lambs. If you don't have lambs, you can't bring bread. But the bread, you don't have to bring the bread in order to bring the lambs. Shekain matzinu kishahayu Yisrael b'midbar 40 shana karbu kvasim below lechem. Because what we found was, if you go back to what did the Jewish people do in the wilderness? Well, they didn't have bread, and there are two reasons that they might not have had bread. We'll deal with that in a moment. But they brought the lambs, because presumably they brought the sacrifices that it says in the Torah during the entire time that they were traveling in the wilderness. So avkan yikruvu kvasim below lechem. So too here you can bring the rams even without the bread. So Rashi here says bamidbar kirvu kvasim below lechem. It's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 lines down, 7 lines down in the narrow lines of Rashi. Kilomer below shtei halechem habayim im shnei kvasim. They brought in the wilderness. They didn't bring the 2 loaves of bread. Sharei omer ushtei halechem, because the omer sacrifice that's on the second day of Pesach, and the 2 breads that are offered, einan ba'in elam min haaretz. They have to be brought from produce from the land of Israel. And so as a result, that's why they didn't do it. Tozos offers a different explanation, citing a Rashi that we don't have. Perish bekuntris, this is the top Tosos on Memhei Mabet. Perish bekuntris, shalo hayalahem elaman. The reason that they didn't have bread is because the only thing they had to eat was the manna. And so as a result, that's the explanation. So either one of these explanations are fine, but the bottom line is that's the reason that Rabbi Shimon ben Nanas says they didn't actually. You don't need to you can bring lambs even without bread, but you can't bring bread without lambs. Rabbi Shimon, and this is Rabbi Shimon ben Yochai. Halacha kedivrei ben Nanas, aval eina tam kidvarav. The halacha is like him, but you know what? His reasoning is wrong. Shekol ha'omer b'chud mishkapakudim karav b'midbar. Because the only thing that was brought in the wilderness were the sacrifices that are mentioned in Sefer Bamidbar, in Parshas Pinchas. B'kol ha'omer b'toras kohanim in Karev B'midbar. But what was mentioned in Sefer Vayikra was not brought in the wilderness. But when they came into the land of Israel, they brought both of them. So why, if in fact the rationale, because again, the rationale of Ben Nanas was the fact that during the wilderness they brought the lambs without the bread, and so that shows that you could bring the lambs without the bread. But they didn't, according to what Rabbi Shimon ben Yochai is saying. They didn't bring those lambs without the bread, because they didn't have to bring those lambs until they came into the land of Israel, because those lambs are mentioned only in Sefer Vayikra and not in Sefer Bamidbar. So why is it that they can bring lambs without the bread? Because the what is it that allows the Kohanim to eat the lambs? It's the sprinkling of the blood of those lambs. So the thing that permits the lambs is the lambs itself. Below halechem, below kvasim. But when it comes to the bread, that bread is never actually. It's not like you take part of the bread and you put it on the altar, and that then permits the rest of the bread to be eaten by the Kohanim. No, the only time that the bread is permitted to be eaten by the Kohanim is when you put the blood of the lambs or put the lambs themselves with the part of the lambs that are being sacrificed on the altar. She'ein lo miyitirena. And so as a result, if you don't have the lambs, so then there's nothing that can be permitted. So as a result, the lambs are essential to bringing the bread, because the only way the bread could ever be permitted to eat is as a result of the lambs. Whereas when it comes to the lambs, they are permitted on their own. So you don't need to have bread in order for them to be kosher. So that is and so that is why the Shtei Alechem can never be valid without the lambs. Okay, so now we have the Gemara as we continue on Memhei Mebet, and the Gemara is going to quote a brisa that provides a Torah basis for the opinions in our Mishnah. So Tanu Rabbanan. V'hikrabdem al alechem, or at least for the end of our Mishnah, specifically the idea that certain korbanot were not offered, namely that the korbanot in Sefer Vayikra were not offered until they entered the land of Israel. V'hikrabdem al alechem, so the Torah says that they should be brought on the bread. Chova al alechem. That implies that only when you have the bread are you going to bring the sacrifices. Shivas kvasim tamimim. But then it says 7 unblemished lambs. What is that suggesting? Af al pi she'ein lechem. Meaning bring the lambs even if you, as long as they're unblemished, bring them as the complete things. Meaning that there's a completeness, right? Timimim, although we translate it as unblemished, it really means complete. And so the point is that the 7 lambs are complete. It constitutes the whole thing. And so as a result, that's the idea that we have here. And so as a result, afal pi she'ein lechem, meaning even if you don't have the bread, you should still bring the lambs. Im kain matam alomer al halechem. Why does it say that you should then bring the lambs on the bread? You're not obligated to bring those lambs until you're obligated to bring the bread. And when Divrei Rabbi Tarfon, that's what Rabbi Tarfon says. And the Gemara, the Shita Mikubetzes here, removes the reference to Rabbi Akiva Omer and says Yachol hein kvasim hamurim kan. Now you might have thought that these same lambs that are mentioned here in Vayikra, that they're also the same 7 lambs that are mentioned in Bamidbar. Amarta, but then you'll say, but then when you come to the bulls and the rams, you see that they're not the same. There's a different number. There are 2 bulls and 1 ram in Sefer Bamidbar, and 1 bull and 2 rams in Sefer Vayikra. So Ella halalu ba'in biglal atzman, v'halalu ba'in biglal lechem. So the ones that are in Bamidbar come on their own because there's no reference to the bread regarding them. But the ones that are mentioned in Sefer Vayikra are only brought because of the bread. And so that is teaching us Nimsa Masha Amar B'Chomesh HaBekudim Kara Bamidbar. That shows that what is mentioned in Sefer Bamidbar, they bring it even in the wilderness. Masha Amar B'Torah's Kohanim Lo Gara Bamidbar. But what is mentioned in Sefer Vayikra is not brought in the wilderness. The Dilma Parim Ve'elim Lav Inhu hakvasim inhu ninhu. Maybe, one second, how do you know that the whole set is different? Maybe the two bulls and one ram, and the one ram, oh, and the one bull and two rams, those are different between Sefer Bamidbar and Sefer Vayikra. But the seven rams that are mentioned in both are the same seven rams. Maybe that's the case. No, that's not good. Midahani ishtene, hani nami da'achrine. Once we're going to have changes in numbers with respect to the bulls and the rams, it must be that the lambs are also different. Uparim be'elim imayde ishtanu. How do you know that they're different? Dilma hakikama rachman. Maybe what the Torah is telling us is the following: Iboy par ushnei elim likarev, iboy shnei parim va'ayel echad likarev. You can choose. Maybe you can bring one bull and two rams, or you can bring two bulls and one ram. Maybe that's what the Torah is saying. No, that's not what the Torah is saying. Nah, because if you take a look between Sefer Vayikra and Sefer Bamidbar, they change the order. Because as Rashi tells us, Sidran, there it's 5, 10, 15, about 20 lines up from the bottom of the Rashi on Memheyam Abet. The B'Torah's Kohanim, when it comes to the Sefer Vayikra, Kvasim, Upar, Ve'elim. The order is lambs, then bull, and then rams. But Ubepinchas, V'Kravtem Parim, Ve'ayil, V'Kvasim. And then so it goes bulls, ram, lambs. So the order is different. And so as a result, maybe that's what shows that it must be totally different sets of animals. And so as a result, that is why we can say that the animals that are referenced in Sefer Vayikra were not brought until they entered the land of Israel, but the animals that are referenced in Sefer Bamidbar were brought even in the wilderness. Okay, so now our Mishnah had said that the halecha ma'akev es hakvasim, that according to Rabbi Akiva, the bread is essential to the lambs. So what's his reasoning? My time of the Rabbi Akiva. So gamar yeyu mi tihiyena. So it's important to know the psukim that we're talking about here. So the pasuk in this is a Perek Kafchet, pasuk kaf, says the following. So, hold on just a second. Find it. So, Perek Kaf Gimel, pasuk Kaf of we're talking about in Sefer Vayikra. It says Vehiniv HaKohen Otam, that the Kohen should wave them al halechem, with the bread habikurim, from the first produce, tenufa, a waving with Nei Hashem, before God, al shnei kvasim kodesh yiyu la Hashem la kohen. The two lambs will be holy. They will be to God for the kohen. So there is the word yehiyu in that pasuk, but it is unclear to what that yehiyu refers to. Does it refer to the kvasim, that's what's mentioned immediately before, or is it referring to the lechem, which is also mentioned in that pasuk? And so that's the debate. So now we understand what the question is. The question is yehiyu in pasuk kaf. What do we learn it from? So Rabbi Akiva says gamar yehiyu mi tehiyena. So we learn it from the pasuk Tiyena. That's the pasuk Yud Zayin, where it says, "Mimoshvosechem taviu lechem." From your dwelling places you bring bread. Tenufa shtayim shnei esronim solas tiyena chametz teafena bikurim laHashem. So the word Tiyena there is telling us that the two loaves of bread are required for one another. And so what we do is we say, just as we have Yehiyu in Pasuk Kaf, so we have Tiyena in Pasuk Yud Zayin. So what it's telling us in Pasuk Kaf is that the bread is essential to the bringing of the lambs. And so that is how Rabbi Akiva rules. The bread is necessary for the lambs. The lambs are not necessary for the bread. So malahalon lechem, just in pasuk Yud Zayin, it's referring to bread. Avkan lechem. So too here, the bread is what is essential, and so the bread is essential to the lambs, not vice versa. Ubenanis gamar yehu yehu. Benanis learns the word yehu to the word yehu in pasuk Yud Chet, where in pasuk Yud Chet. Malahalan kivasim in pasuk Yud Chet, which says v'ikravtem al halechem shivas kivasim timimim b'nei shana upar ben bakar echad ve'elim shnayim yehiyu olala Hashem umin chasam v'niskayem ishay reach nichoach Hashem. That's the pasuk that says that each of the sacrifices must be brought. So that the olot sacrifices must be brought. And so as a result, he's going to learn from that. Malahalan kvasim, just as that includes lambs. Avkan kvasim, here too. Although that one refers to olot, here it's referring to the lambs of the shlamim. And so it's telling us that in order to bring the lechem, you need to have the kvasim, and not the other way around. That even without the lechem, you can still have the kvasim. Ubenanis nami nelef mitiyena. Well, why doesn't Benanis learn from Tiyena? Mala halon lechem avkan lechem. Why not learn the lesson that Rabbi Akiva did? Danan yehiyu mi yehiyu ve'in danan yehiyu mitiyena. Well, the word yehiyu is a lot closer to the word yehiyu than the word yehiyu is to the word Tiyena. So my nafkamino, who cares that it's so close? But Hatana debei Rabbi Yishmael, as we've seen many times in our journeys together through Shas, the Shava Kohen, Uva Kohen, Zeu Shiva v'Zeu Bia. That the yeshiva of Rabbi Yishmael learns in connection with the halachot associated with the tsaras, that when it comes to the Kohen looking at the tsaras and the Kohen returning, it's referring to the same thing, and we can have, even though the word is completely different, the concept is the same, and we can have a gzera shava from one to the other. So who cares that Yehiyu and Tiyena are that different? They're certainly more similar than Vishava Kohen and Uvah Kohen. So no, honey mili heka deleka damila. No, you're right that you can't that you can make a gzera shava based on the meaning of the words, but that's when you don't have a gzera shava possibility that is involving words that are identical. But aval hecha deika dedamile, when you have words that are much more comparable, mededamile yalfin, you learn it from the word that's more comparable. For Rabbi Akiva, nami leilav yeyu mi yeyu. Well, why doesn't Rabbi Akiva learn like Benanis? So done in davar shematana lekohen mi davar shematana lekohen la puki hani de olos ninhu. Well, the verse 18 is talking about korban olot. Korban olot are all for Hashem. There is no aspect that is given to the Kohen from the meat. And so as a result, we're going to do something that's given to the Kohen. And so as a result, just as the bread is given to the Kohanim, so too we'll learn it from from the earlier reference to bread, which is given to the Kohanim. So that's why we're going to learn from there. So the ibayas ema bekra gufe kamifligate. Or you can say, you know what? The argument between Rabbi Akiva and Benanis is not about where you make a gzera shava. You may not even need a gzera shava. That here's what the pasuk, the debate is about the pasuk itself. Bekra gufe kamifligate. They're arguing about this verse kaf itself. Kodesh yeyu laHashem laKohen. What does it mean that that's going to be holy to God for the Kohen? Rabbi Akiva sabar eze davar shekulan laKohen. What is it that goes to the Kohen? Habei omer zeh lechem. That's the bread. So Benanis says miksiv kodesh yeyu la Kohen. Does it say that it goes to the Kohen alone, directly to the Kohen? No, it says la Hashem la Kohen. Kodesh yeyu la Hashem la Kohen ksiv. So eza hu davar shemikso miksaso la Hashem miksaso la Kohen. What is it that goes partially to the God and partially to the Kohen? Heve omer elu kvasim. That is referring to the lambs. for Rabbi Akiva. So what does Rabbi Akiva say back to that? That sounds like a good argument. So miksiv kodesh yu la Hashem villa kohen. No, it's not a good argument because it doesn't say what's to kodesh for Hashem and for the kohanim or and to the kohen. Rather la Hashem la kohen ksiv kid Rav Huna, and Rav Huna has a statement elsewhere in connection with that same phrase of la Hashem la kohen that when it comes to the property of a convert who has unfortunately passed away, and the convert was stolen from, and now he's supposed to get not just his money back, but even a bonus. And the question is who gets that? The parsha in Sefer Bamidbar says La Hashem La Kohen. So Amar Rav Huna Kano Hashem Unasano La Kohen, that it says it's awarded to God has acquired it and awarded it to the Kohen, and so as a result it goes to the Kohen, and so we're at the two dots and we'll pick up from there. So just as the bottom line is that just as that regarding something that's stolen from a convert, the restitution goes to the Kohen through Hashem. It's as if Hashem gave it to the Kohen. So too with respect to this, and with that we'll conclude. Again, we'll now have one final statement about something where Rabbi Akiva and Benanis agree, but we're at the two dots, so we'll stop there and pick up, God willing, tomorrow.